Acrylic paints, like these, can be one of the hardest things to paint with. Or they can be one of the easiest. You can get good with acrylics really fast, but you need to do it the right way. Just gonna put these down. It's pretty common advice to work fast with acrylics because they dry really quickly. I've been painting with acrylics for over 15 years, and honestly, that advice couldn't be more wrong. So in this video, I'm going to share with you the 5 things that I did that made acrylic painting really easy. The first thing to do, and nobody really tells you this, is to just have a play around with the paint. You won't believe how many acrylic paintings that I've seen that just aren't good, but could be fixed with one really simple exercise. The main problem is, most beginners don't really understand how to manipulate and move the paint to make it work for them. So the first really simple exercise is to learn about the consistency of the paint and how it affects it. Take your paint straight out of the tube and brush it onto the canvas. Try a couple of brushes, try thick marks, try thin marks. Get a feel for how the paint works. Then add a little bit of water, just a tiny bit. Mix it with the paint and see how it changes. Repeat this process, gradually adding more water and experimenting with it as the paint gets thinner and thinner. Because of the way that most acrylic paints just are, it takes quite a bit of water to make them usable for things like details. Oil paints don't really need thinning out as much. They can be used straight out of the tube and they can be used to paint small details. But acrylics aren't like that. So when people switch from oils to acrylics, or they're just starting out with acrylics for the first time, they struggle adding details because they don't thin the paint down enough. But you can make mistakes with that too. You can go too thin. Some acrylic paints are very thin already. Some are quite thick, like these heavy body ones, and some are sort of in between. You really need to find paints that work best for you and the way that you paint. Which is why playing around and feeling how different consistencies affect how that paint moves is a really good starting point. Because it really helped me to understand what paint I needed for what situation. And honestly, it made my paintings better and my process so much faster. So we can use water to thin the paints, and that is great. But there are a couple of problems with that. You'll have some people saying that water affects how well the paint sticks to the canvas. That can be true slightly, depending on the quality of the canvas that you've got, and if you've not covered that canvas with a thing called gesso. Let me just... This is gesso. So it doesn't really matter which brand you use, but the gesso helps the paint stick to the canvas. If the canvas is properly prepared with this, then water is perfectly fine to thin down your paints with, to an extent. The main problem with using water as a medium is that as you add more water to the paint, the more transparent, the more see-through that paint becomes. Which means even though we can paint really fine details with it, we might not actually be able to see those details, which makes it a bit pointless. So how can we fix that? The first, and this is probably what all of the anti-acrylic watery people are going to say, is use mediums. So there's things like glazing mediums, like this, which you could use to slow down the drying time of your acrylics, and you can also use it to thin out those acrylics and keep them a little bit less transparent than they would be if you'd thinned it down with water. Also, those anti-water people will say this is better than just using water. So yeah, I mostly just use water, and I have had no problems at all with any of the paintings I've ever created. It's just how you use it. There's a reason why I just use water, and that is because sometimes with those glazing mediums, and other mediums like that, you can skip some certain steps. You don't even realise you're skipping those steps. But basically, in order to achieve an oil painting like effect, a really highly detailed, highly rendered painting with acrylics, you need to build up in layers. And I think using water and allowing the paint to become transparent and building up your painting in layers, one, doesn't require any extra materials, and two, I believe actually results in a much better finish to the painting. Oil paints can just be blended together wet into wet, and oil paints are a lot more opaque than acrylic colours, so they cover the canvas a lot more easily. Whereas with acrylics, you can get sort of like patchy bits, you can get bits where the canvas shows through, and honestly it just looks a little bit amateurish. But the solution to that is building up in layers. We don't need to rush either. We can be a lot slower and a lot more controlled than other people would have you believe when you're working with acrylics. It's okay to be slow. It's okay to be deliberate with what you're doing. We don't need to rush. We can use the drying process and the speed of that drying time to our advantage. We don't have to race against it. We can build up lots and lots and lots of layers of acrylics. We can do that much faster than we can with oil paints because oil paints take so long to dry. And those layers are just going to add depth and variation and luminosity to the painting that you wouldn't be able to get without using layers. But the actual way that we layer, the techniques and the process that we follow can have a major impact on what the finished painting looks like. So if we start with a dark base and then add lighter layers of paint on top, we can give the illusion of depth. It looks like there are 3D layers to the painting, which you can actually reach through and almost touch and feel. And that's especially good for creating textures like fur or leaves on trees. But that's not the only way that we can layer. We can also add darker paint on top of lighter paint. And that is really good for adding shading, which allows us to establish form and make things look more 3D. But we can also use it to adjust the colours or create vibrant, luminous colours, which you wouldn't be able to do without using that layering technique. Both of those techniques can be used to create some really, really cool effects. And speaking of effects, we can actually use loads of different tools in the painting. We don't just have to use brushes. One example are these, palette knives. And these are great for adding texture to a painting. But we can also actually use these to add fine details. I use them for little strands of fur and also for a little bit more texture, more 3D blades of grass. I can get a much finer line with this than I can with a brush. And because the paint dries so fast, any texture that we add with the palette knife, we can actually add paint layers over the top, and that can create even more cool effects. There's just so many different ways of applying acrylic paints onto a canvas. We've looked at using paint that gets watered down, but what about the other way? Can we use really dried, not very watered down paint? And absolutely we can. One of my favourite techniques to use is called scumbling, or you might have heard it called dry brushing. This is commonly done with oil paints, but it can be done with acrylics as well. Scumbling is where you take a very, very small amount of paint just on the tip of the brush, and the best brushes to use for this technique are actually bristle brushes. They're a bit firmer and a little bit stiffer. And then you're just going to take a little bit of tissue paper and basically just wipe that brush almost clean. So there's barely any paint on the brush. It's basically just stained the brush a colour. Then you take that brush and you scrub it over the surface of the canvas. And then that paint will transfer onto the canvas and it'll be almost like misty and hazy rather than solid paint. And it's great for adding things like clouds or dusty textures to a painting. Acrylics can be a very difficult medium to master, and if you do have a bit of trouble with the drying time still, if you can't use it to your advantage, then I do actually have two solutions for you. First is one of these, a stay wet palette. So this is the inside. It's got this piece of foam inside which you wet and that remains quite damp, and then you pop some of these little sort of like pieces of almost like plasticky paper that just sits on top of that, and it keeps your paint wet. It's really good. When you finish painting for the day, you can even pop the lid back on and that paint will stay wet for weeks, absolutely no problem. And that is a great solution. I do find that using one of these, it does thin your paints out quite a lot, so you do struggle getting that opaqueness, that solid looking paint using this technique, but that's fine. The other option is using something like this. This is an acrylic retarder medium, and this is basically going to increase the drying time of the paint. It means you can blend a little bit more wet into wet, and it's great for keeping the paint wet on the palette for much longer. I've used this and had paints last for weeks again. The thing with this is that it is never gonna just turn your acrylic paint into oil paints. That's not how it works. It will extend the drying time of the paints a little bit, but not very much. So you might have 20 to 30 seconds longer to mix the paints on the canvas than you would do if you didn't use it. But usually that's enough time to create what you need to create. We've done a few more than 5 tips, so that's one of your rewards for sticking it out till this far in the video, but I'm going to give you one final piece of advice. Use the quick drying time of the acrylics to your advantage. And I can't stress that enough. Be controlled with your brushwork, so think about what it is that you're doing, but don't be afraid to make mistakes. People that use acrylics tend to be a little bit tighter with the work because they're scared that it dries so quickly, they're scared to experiment, they're scared to make mistakes because they're racing against that drying time. They're rushing everything, and that results in a much tighter looking painting. There isn't that artistic freedom and looseness and flow that you get in oil paints. Just accept that acrylic paints dry really fast, and that's a good thing. It just means if you make a mistake, you can paint over it really quickly. Hopefully you're going to try out some of these tips and you're going to find them helpful with your own work. And if you'd like to learn a little bit more about my process and the techniques that I use for my acrylic paintings, then I have full narrated tutorials over on my Studio Wildlife Patreon. I couldn't do what I do without the support of everyone on Patreon. So as always, thank you so much and thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.